will be based on that product, that corn product. So it won't be simple. And I think the cost to do it would be extravagant for some of the major manufacturers and food processors. So what would they actually do then? They're probably already in the futures market. They would have that tied down. But what happens if, say, they can't get those deliveries? And it would be very, very interesting. I think we're just going to see somewhat of a reduction in products. I think they're going to try and get as much in as they can.
Hey, and good afternoon, everyone. Today, Neil McCoy Ward. We're going to discuss things that are happening right now, how these problems might affect you directly, and then some solutions so you can protect yourselves, your families, and get ready for these changes that are coming in so swift, all-encompassing, but it's going to happen in a blink of an eye. Because can you remember January 1st, 2022, Happy New Year, just a few months back? Well, these changes we're talking about are going to happen that quickly. Everything we talk about today, at least on my end, and the very first step into what I would consider a reset of our society, not in the Klaus Schwab way, but literally a reset based on disposable income, food pricing, energy prices. This affects everybody directly. What you eat, what your kids eat, what your family has access to in the supermarkets. We'll be here no later than the end of September, no first week of October. So if we trace that out, we're looking at about 5 months. So Neil, I appreciate you joining me today, and I'll put the links in the description box below. And as you were telling me, you had the 3-part series on the Great Depression on Neil McCoy Ward YouTube channel. Highly suggested there. And you were saying that, I'll even put words in your mouth. You were taking diaries from family libraries during that time and explaining. Now, I've been watching a lot of 1930s series of lifestyles also, and it's almost as if we could take out a single name and replace it with a modern name today, and we're living the almost identical chapter of history. And also following into World War I, again, it's the same thing. It's almost the same nations, the same players. You could replace a lot of what you consider today's leaders of those same nations, and we're looking at a script that was taken directly out of the entry into World War I. So there's many chapters here lining up. And Neil, I like your content anyway, and nobody better to talk to. So I'm going to leave it there. The floor is yours. And we discussed a little bit before what we wanted to cover. So I think it's just going to be an easy conversation with some solutions. So everybody kick back, enjoy, and then, we are going to discuss the problem first, but we're not going to go into fear, the doom, and the gloom. That's not what this is about. It's understanding the problem and be able to find some solutions. So Neil, thank you and welcome.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I appreciate that, David. Yeah, and you're actually right in what you're saying about the historical patterns. One of the things I really focus on, and I guess it was more of a hobby for me, which is history. Just looking at history. Originally, it was military history. So I absolutely love military history. That's what it started as. But then it came into other parts of history, studying lots of different cycles of history. And that's how, just like you were saying, I was able to see, hold on, what we're seeing today, we've seen this before. Actually, I could pinpoint 7 or 8 different times when that same pattern had taken place. And we're definitely in another cycle right now. Whether you call that the fourth turning, which is Howe's models, whether you look at it from any of the models, there's so many of these different cyclical models. We're definitely there now. We are definitely in this crisis period. And the crisis period, really, if you look at a lot of the charts and you look at a lot of the forecasts from the 3-letter organizations, they tend to go from 2020 through to about 2030. Pretty much all of them. It doesn't matter whether you're looking at WEF or any of these sort of 3-letter organizations. They're all showing the same sort of forecast, 2020 to 2030, with 2025 being a sort of peak of the crisis period. So we've still got another 3 years before we before we get there. And one thing I was just saying to you offline was about some books, actually. One of the things I always get asked about is books. So I've just grabbed a couple of books today that are on my desk here. And these are books that subscribers and my Patreon members send me all the time. You know, they just post me books and gifts and stuff like that. So this was a recent one I got. This is Our Mysterious Panics from Coleman. Fantastic book. This is easily over 100 years old. Another one by Claude Bowers, The Tragic Era. I think this one is early 1900s as well. Grapes of Wrath. I think most people have heard of this one, The Grapes of Wrath. And then this is a popular one that's doing the rounds at the moment, The Great Leveler. And there's one thing I'll pick up on with this book, which is not quite accurate. And it's basically called The Violence and the History of Inequality. And what this book is outlining is that every time we have inequality, which is what we have right now, social and maybe mainly financial inequality, where the rich are super wealthy now, so much to the point that it's insane how much they own. And the poor and middle class are sort of in that same category. And the one thing I'd say that's not quite accurate with this book is that there is one case in history of where wealth inequality didn't end in violence, and that was under Solon. So he was an Athenian, 630 to 560 BC, if my memory's correct there. And what he actually did was what some of the things we're seeing at the moment, which was he basically put these sort of very high taxes on the wealthy, the Athenian elite of the time. And he just taxed them so much that he did a wealth distribution, a form of socialism. He redistributed all that wealth, and it actually, well, they say, according to the history books, which we don't know how accurate they are, they get rewritten all the time, that sort of stopped this big violent revolution. But that's a great book. Great Wave is another one sent by a subscriber to me. Excellent book about revolution and the history. And then one of the thing I mentioned at the start, The Fourth Turning. So these are all really great reference books for patterns and cycles. And they're my sort of go-to books, really, with a little bit of this.
Yeah, you can start to see. Now, let me ask you, since you're an avid reader on the cycles of history, now the onset of the cycle, which is right now, there's a lot of things matching up with magnetic fields of our planet declining, which are allowing our jet streams and cloud cells to move to different locations, just unchecked. They're going wherever they like. Got the equatorial vortex, which is a new term a lot of people will start hearing as we get warmer weather moving north. And we're familiar with the Arctic vortex, where the cold air permeates further south down to Cuba if you're in the northern hemisphere. But these equatorial vortices are going to also be making the news this summer as our magnetic field has weakened even further, and the magnetic north has even transited further east and further south. So we're going to even get more perturbations or upsets and movements in what we consider a stable atmosphere. So the onset, let me ask you with the onset. Now, if we're coming into something that's been stable, such as planting and growing and harvesting dates for 150 years, I'll say that, and now it's completely out of sync. So in your opinion, coming into in the very beginning of the onset of a cycle, is that the most tumultuous time, or would be the peak of the cycle, or would be the exit out of the cycle? Which one do you think is going to be the most disruptive for our society and our current way of life and governance and economy?
Yeah, I think it's probably somewhere in the middle of that, actually. So whenever you come into these, and it, again, doesn't have to be about crops, it can be all sorts of things. Take China and the globalization breakdown, for example. What you saw, so we'll use that example because that's something that, you know, I focus on a lot more, is the economics and finance and, you know, trade and things like that. Now, you think what happened when all those lockdowns took place? We had a glut of inventory throughout Western nations, and it was just sat there doing nothing. And then we saw a bout of deflation in 2020 across airlines and, you know, hotels and vacations and all this sort of stuff. And a lot of goods that were just sat there, old inventory, summer beach shorts, for examples, bikinis that were never going to be worn. So you saw all this stuff. So you saw a deflationary period there. But then what actually happened after that was we went into this inflationary period as we tried to get in a lot of goods and services from China. Of course, we saw the breakdown in supply chains and all the ships, and couldn't unload and couldn't load and all that sort of thing. So what we had was this same pool of money, which actually is not quite accurate because the pool increased. A lot of people misunderstand this around quantitative easing and the currency supply, where people say, well, the QE, which is the increase of money, putting more money in, it doesn't get into the economy. Well, that's not quite true, because if you think about stimulus and furlough and unemployment, that is from via government bonds, the central bank, and it gets pumped into the economy. That's what happens. It goes in, and then you see the velocity of money increase, and you see goods and services increasing because we have more currency units, let's say, instead of saying dollars or pounds or euros, chasing the same amount of goods and services. But what happened was you had more money, currency, chasing less amounts of goods and services. So what do we see? We see this sort of chaotic period where it's still going on now. You see it all the time, especially in America. People say, I ordered my car 6 months ago. I can't get my car. Or the secondhand, or the used car market exploding up with pricing there. Why? Well, you can't get new cars, but you're also seeing a lot of issues around getting spares and parts for those cars and semiconductors and the craziness around that. So you tend to see a crisis period when you first see the entry position, and that can be in sort of producers. That's what we saw it with the deflationary effects. And then the crisis sort of transitions to consumers, which is what we're seeing now. It's not the producers and the companies that are having issues at the moment. It's more the consumers that are getting destroyed by inflation, losing their wealth, really, or their life. Imagine this, David. You have worked 50 years of your life. You've saved up all this money. Maybe it was a low-paying job. 50 years of your life, and then you're getting hit by 10 or 15, more likely, if you measure the CPI accurately, bouts of inflation. Your money's just getting absolutely wiped out in the bank. So this is how these sort of cycles tend to go. So it's a bit of, as you asked, it's the entry position and the exit position. You have this chaos all the way through.
I was reading an article over in the UK. They're looking at 5% of disposable income out of each family is going to be set up for home heating, at least coming into this season, which is, and I'm really wondering what's going to be the catalyst that sends people to the street. Is it going to be the food that they can't afford, the non-availability of the food, the home heating that gets too expensive where they have to choose to eat or heat? Or is it going to be the actual petrol that's not there, so they can't drive their cars, they can't go to work? But I mean, what does that ratio break in history when things become so overbearingly expensive that people can't even afford the dailies in life, and then they spill over onto the streets and want change? Now in America, that's going to take a very different form than it does in Europe or in the UK there.
Yeah, good question. And you're right in what you're saying. It's different for different parts of the world. So what are we seeing? I don't know if you've covered it much on your channel, but what are we seeing at the moment? Sri Lanka. That is a key one to look at the moment. And I won't go into all the background behind it, but they tried a different type of food program. They didn't want to use fertilizers and all this other stuff. But of course, you don't use fertilizers, your yield drops dramatically. And then they had to rely on imports, sovereign debt crisis. All these sort of things happen with Sri Lanka. But let's get to the point of what actually happened. The people peacefully protested. They said, we need food, we need this, we've got these issues. And it's the same cycle every time. The politicians don't do anything. They just say, who cares? Not affecting us. We've got our own business going on. We're doing whatever we're doing in the background. Until then people start to get more and more angry. It's called tipping point theory. So they keep pushing, they keep pushing, they keep pushing. Nothing's happening. Okay, here we go. Let's tip over. And it goes into a period of not just protest, but riot. So you sort of see that flip from protest to riot. And then once it goes, it's just like a water hose. It went. So you saw in the last couple of weeks, just mobs pulling politicians out of kicking the doors in, pulling them out of their homes, stopping their cars, pulling them out of their cars, in the street, burning their homes down. And then the politicians react in a similar way. They say, shoot on sight. Any protester you see, anyone doing anything that they consider to be more extreme, shoot on sight, shoot. And now we've got a number of deaths. We have hundreds, if not 1,000 at this point, injuries. And this is the tipping point. Now, will we see the same sort of thing playing out in Europe and America? Yes, tipping point is the same thing no matter where you are, but it will just play out a little bit differently. In the West, we are wealthier purely by nature, by fluke, whatever you want to say. We have a lot more money. So we have a lot more disposable income, and we can use that disposable income to buy food. So yes, I actually agree with you with what you're saying about the food crisis that's on the way. But I think the developing nations are the ones that are going to get hit by famine, and it will be famine first, and it's going to be very, very severe. Whereas the Western nations, you're going to see food shortages, but you're going to see extremely high food inflation. And if you believe some of the war games from 2015, they're talking about 400% food inflation by 2025, which they've been pinpoint accurate for the last 7 years on every piece of that study. So that's worrying. So yeah, it's not sort of good times ahead. And I've actually printed off, because I thought you might ask me about wheat since I've been talking about it recently. I just printed off the main exporters of wheat right now and the main importers of wheat. And a lot of people were asking me over the last few weeks how I was able to forecast Sri Lanka and Peru and some of the other nations that are in social unrest right now. It's not that I'm, a magician. I have some sort of foresight. I just follow the food. The expression follow the money. I follow the food. So who imports wheat, for example? Well, China imports a lot. Egypt imports more than 10% of global wheat. So they're importing a huge amount of wheat. Indonesia, Turkey, Philippines, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nigeria, Algeria, all these places, they are major importers, not just of wheat, but other food commodities as well. And a lot of time people forget that just wheat alone, forget about corn and everything else, just wheat alone accounts for 20% of global calories. So people forget this. And I see a lot of comments where people say, I don't eat wheat anyway. I don't care. I only eat meat, or I only eat this. And the wheat is in everything. It's in feeds. It's in everything. So everyone will be affected by what's coming. And again, you can link it to a lot of things, but one of them is, as you were mentioning, changing weather patterns, but another one is the fertilizer. That fertilizer, and this is the problem when globalization breaks down, when you've got one country making most of the fertilizer and they just stop exporting it, you've got a big problem.
Yeah, a couple points there. Now, when you're looking also at who's importing the wheat, also look at the trade deficit based on food sales inbound and outbound both. Now, some of these countries like Indonesia, they could cover if they're going to export more palm oil out. But their new program for internal strategic palm oil reserves for cooking needs to be filled up. I think they're putting 2 million tons into that, and they're going to be exporting 7 million tons this year. But they have export revenue coming in from the palm oil sales. So they can offset some of that, or they could trade, and they could probably do a direct trade with different nations. Because the thing that was startling for me is Indonesia, they just cut off the taps in one single day, and then magically they turned it back on, and then they're having wheat imports because of that. So I think there was some, backroom deal where we'll give you some wheat if you give us the palm oil, make sure you don't turn it all off. But other nations like Sri Lanka, they don't have any option to really trade out or export. So I do want to, you hit the very important point there. What happened with their agriculture? And how does that affect everybody that might be listening to this? Well, the fertilizers, if you're going to go with chemical fertilizers, they're short this year. So are herbicides and pesticides. But they went, Sri Lanka, to a full 100% organic farming lifestyle program with village co-ops producing the fertilizer to then give to the farmers in a regional basis. There are all these pilot projects that were producing their fertilizer for a very localized farm region, and the fertilizer organic was produced there right around where the farms that were using it. But notice what happened, their yields dropped 50%.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're going to bring it back to our own victory gardens again, our own home gardening again, it's great to do it organic. I'm a fan, but you're not going to get the yields that you would if you have just simple chemical fertilizers. And please remember, there's a ratio with that. So, currently it looks about 20% global fertilizer disruption at the moment. But then we add in Ukraine and Russia, and the news media is coming out saying clearly 20% reduction in wheat just from Russia and Ukraine. Now, they're not talking about the elephant in the room, which is the elephant in the room, the fertilizer and herbicide shortage. So it's a simple ratio on fertilizers. It's a 1-to-1 reduction. So your application in the fields, if you reduce 1%, you're going to lose 1% yield. So if you reduce 20% application, which a lot of farmers are going to do, you're going to lose 20% yields out of the fields. And then the herbicides at a 0.8, because there's a lot of different species of, it's not the target crop they're looking for. So if they're going to put out the fertilizer, they don't want to fertilize a bunch of plants that are going to uptake the fertilizer and steal from their target species. So they don't have the herbicides, and they can't remove the plants that they want out of there. Now you're looking at a 1.8 out of that if you're having fertilizer and herbicides. That's a huge reduction. And then they're already talking about 20% out of Ukraine and Russia. We need to talk more about the fertilizers, as you alluded to. Fertilizer and herbicide, I really think, are going to be the thing that takes it down. Forget this resource nationalism and this war. That's the distraction. The real thing you need to focus on is your fertilizers.
Can I just jump in with one point on that, David, actually?
Absolutely.
And that is, it is quite funny because I keep seeing these reports where politicians in different EU nations and America and Canada and all sorts of other places, and the question keeps coming in. It's the same question. What are we going to do about the fertilizer? The politician's either completely naive and doesn't understand the importance of it, even though the farmers' unions are explaining it in detail. They either don't read the reports or they don't care. But the second thing that they say, which is even more concerning, is they say, well, we'll just make our own fertilizer. Now, here's why that's baffling to me. If you think how they make a lot of the fertilizer, they use a lot of natural gas. So there's huge amounts of energy for fertilizer creation. What's happening in Europe right now, in the EU? Have you seen the natural gas prices? They are exploding. In fact, they are so high that this is it's caused already a cost of living crisis in the UK specifically and in Europe. So we can't get enough of this natural gas anyway. And yet we're now going to be taking the natural gas and making fertilizers and everything's going to be fine. Well, no, because what happens if you are paying more for natural gas and then you are using it to create fertilizer? Well, there's a cost input there, which is going to be very high. It then gets passed on to the farmer. The farmer has to, he has to add that cost to the crop. And then what about the transport and everything else around the crop? He's got to actually get that crop. He's got to transport it. That's diesel. Diesel's through the roof. It's got to be there's all these things that are not being talked about, but they have to be talked about from a financial or an economics point of view. This is not going to be going away. These cost inputs that they're not even talking about yet, if they go towards creating their own fertilizer, are going to be enormous on the food supply.
Yeah, that is true. And, take that the next step. So fertilizer, if you're going to go and start home gardening, you're going to have to really think about building your own soils. And how do we as individuals create our own fertilizer outside the centralized delivery system and centralized production system? Well, you're going to have to start looking back into how to start leaf compost piles, or how to take garden clippings that are maybe from some company that will have to pay for disposable, that you can bring onto your own property and then start composting that, reusing the food waste that we throw away every day, or collecting food waste from around the neighborhood and have sort of a centralized, neighborhood composting pile where it can be done more efficiently, more hands at a larger scale. But these are the ways we need to start looking at it, building your soils back to produce your own foods. And that cycle of bringing up fertilizer from, let's say, leaf. I got 23 acres out here, part of it's forest. Well, if I were to save every leaf there and compress them and it would still take months, 6, 8, 10 months, even if I did it properly, to roll it over to give me the compost that I would need to then add to my plants to bring up higher yield. Now, you got to start thinking every time we're talking here about industrial problems or something on the globalization problems, we're going to have to bring that back down into our homes as well, because the time for you relying on centralized delivery to fulfill every life need that you have is quickly passing. We're going to be into an era no later than October where you're going to understand why your grandparents saved everything, why they still had all those old tools that you're like, why grandpa keep just throw those old tools away. You're going to understand that the quality of the steel and the tools is different. These things that we have to revert back to, we're going to step back a little bit to a more pioneering lifestyle. And it's a mental challenge too. I mean, what we talk about with the economy, that's one side of the mental thing of lack, or maybe you feel scared because you might not have the money to afford everything. But the mental clarity you're going to need to overcome to step into this world and embrace it instead of fearing it. That's something very, very different there. And Neil, one last thing, you're talking about the wheat, but corn is the king of everything. So if there's a 40% global corn reduction this year, how's that going to affect manufacturing? And do you think these companies will just stop manufacturing their products and we're going to suddenly see 80% of all boxes on the shelves in the supermarket dry up because literally any box, I'm not going to say 100%, but I would say above 80% of all boxes in every supermarket contain a corn-based derivative product, whether it's a corn starch, an emulsifier, high fructose corn syrup, or whatever it is. Will they just stop manufacturing, or will they try to change recipe midstream?
Yeah, good question. Well, I think that what they will do is they'll try to change recipe. However, it's not quite that simple when it comes to manufacturing, especially food, because your equipment, your machinery, your processes will be based on that product, that corn product. So it won't be simple. And I think the cost to do it would be extravagant for some of the major manufacturers and food processors. So what would they actually do then? They're probably already in the futures market. They would have that tied down. But what happens if, say, they can't get those deliveries? And it would be very, very interesting. I think we're just going to see somewhat of a reduction in products. I think they're going to try and get as much in as they can. And what we've seen previously is companies just buying out entire farms, huge networks of farms, so that they can control it. If you think about someone like in a different field here, but Starbucks and coffee, well, they own a lot of these farms, so they can control the fact that they can guarantee the coffee, although you can't guarantee any sort of crop these days with the weather and things. But yeah, it will be very, very interesting times. But maybe people will become more healthy if they haven't got a lot of this junk in their food, because some of it is not good. But yeah, it'll be an interesting one. We'll have to see how it goes.
Yeah, the change in diet too, that's another thing to consider. So far, at least in my life, and I'm sure yours too, I mean, every time I've walked into a supermarket, there's been foods and the foods that I want to choose. Now, lately, there's been far less fresh vegetables, but it doesn't bother me because we grow our own. We have a massive garden this year, and we're very close to the Amish, about a mile away from one of the Amish farms here. And I'm in the center of farming country. So everywhere you go, like on a weekend, there's people who put little stands out in front of their property out on the road there. And a lot of times it's just an honor system where, okay, take some cabbage away, or it's coming out of that cooler weather harvest. So there's broccolis and cabbage and this sort of thing available right now. Beets, that's real nice. But what's going to happen when people really can't get the fresh vegetables, or they don't have access to the meat? Are you able to switch from, let's say, rice as a staple? If you're going to have something on a side dish, you're able to move into sorghum or maybe buckwheat. I mean, these changes don't sound all that horrific if you're going to be changing what you eat, but in practice and practicality, again, just preparing food at home, there's a learning curve on how to, get harder grains to get softer to bring them up. Sorghum's going to take a fair bit longer to boil up than rice will. So, changes in food consumption as well to think on moving forward.